France President Emmanuel Macron warns West African leaders to stop the growing anti-French sentiments in Africa. President Emmanuel Macron, during the NATO summit in London, demanded West African leaders to dismiss growing anti-French sentiments across the region if they wanted France's military aid to continue in its operation against Islamic militants. When asked about the troops in Africa and the ever-growing anti-French sentiments in the continent, he had this to say: "I can't have French troops on the ground in the Sahel when there is ambiguity towards anti-French movements and sometimes comments made by politicians and ministers. I want them, meaning leaders of Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad and Mauritania, to clarify and formalize their demands regarding France and the international community. Do they want our presence and do they need it? I want a clear answer to these questions." Given what they have lived through, I believe they owe us clarity. France is not there, contrary to what's heard sometimes, for neocolonialism, imperialism or economic reasons. They are for the collective security of the region. Their response is today a necessary condition for our troops to stay, he said. The French government has faced criticism at home and in Africa that its 4,500 troops are bogged down, while critical voices in the region have increasingly scorned Paris for failing to restore stability and anti-French sentiment continuing to grow.
Hello family, welcome to African Esquire TV, and I'm your host, Tierney Cherie. We've been talking a lot on this channel about the colonial influence in Africa, and in particularly about France's colonial influence in former Francophone colonies. Now, if you don't know, France, although technically they're not colonizing West African countries as far as the official legal definition of colonization, however, neocolonialism is just as effective as colonialism. And in the case of France, the degree of neocolonialism is so strong to the point where we honestly have to question whether or not former Francophone countries are colonized or not. So, for example, there's a colonial tax that has been enacted inside of former Francophone countries where they have to pay a certain amount of their national reserves to the French government. There are certain military requirements that former Francophone countries have. For example, because they receive their support from France, they have to go to France if they want permission to invade another country, or if they want to intervene on behalf of another country. Let's say there's a conflict going on, they have to get permission from France. Now, this is supposed to be independent sovereign countries, yet they have these requirements to actually do what the French government tells them to do and to get permission from them. And that's just one, those are just two conditions. There are a number of conditions that the French government requires of West African countries, even something as simple as trading. For example, let's say there's a natural resource that's found inside of a West African former Francophone country. They have to get permission from France to sell that resource to other countries outside of France. They first have to give France the opportunity to buy that resource, which of course gives the French a monopoly on that industry and allows them to basically exploit the people and not allow the West African country to have competition for offers to actually buy these types of materials from that government. So these are just some of the conditions that happened in the current 2019 West African countries. Now, as I said, one of the requirements was a military requirement that they have to get permission from France, but also the French military is very heavily inside of these West African countries. So I'm going to read from an article that is going to explain some new developments that have happened that basically has the President of France ticked off and ready to tell the West African countries that you need to come here on December 16th or you will face some ramifications. So the title of this article is Macron issues a stern rebuke to West Africa after Mali deaths. This is on Bloomberg and it will be in the description box. President Emmanuel Macron summoned West African leaders to France to talks following the death of 13 French soldiers in Mali last week, and suggested that he could pull his troops out of the country if he doesn't like what he hears. You heard that correctly. Let's just pause. So the president is saying, if I don't like what I hear from you West African countries, I will pull my troops out of the country. So just pay attention. This is a colonial relationship. Even though, in fact, it's not, it is de facto a colonial relationship because of the type of power that he's yielding over these countries, where he could actually give them an ultimatum. Could you imagine the West African countries giving the French government an ultimatum? Could you imagine them saying that if you don't do this, then we're going to do this? No, because they are beholden to the French power. So as I go on, okay, so the president says, I can't, nor do I want French soldiers on the ground while there is anti-French sentiment that is sometimes held by the leaders of some of the African countries, Macron said at a news conference during a NATO summit in Watford, England. The leaders of 5 West African nations, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad, should come to France on December 16th to provide clarification. Now, this is what the president of France is saying. He's summoning those 5 countries to France and saying that you need to provide clarifications on this anti-French sentiment. Now, you might be saying, what's anti-French sentiment? Well, although you don't see it broadcast as much, the people inside of these former Francophone countries are basically up to here with France. They have had enough. We've seen a display of this where several West African countries have said they're going to withdraw their national reserves from the French central bank. That is just one example. The people all over, they're over the French currency, the CFA franc. They're tired of the France being inside of their country and intermingling inside of their affairs. So you have a lot of people who are starting to wake up on the ground and say, we don't want France inside of West Africa. Now, of course, this makes the president of France, this makes him nervous, because we all know, we've said it 1,000 times on this channel, without West Africa, and particularly without the relationship that France has with those former Francophone countries, France would just slide into darkness. It will cease to be a power. It will cease to be significant, because that country depends on the exploitation that happens between France and the West African countries. So understand, this is a man who's speaking nervously. This is someone who understands what time it is, as far as former Francophone countries no longer wanting the French influence, and this is someone who's trying to find some type of way to cling to his power in the region. So to go on, there were soldiers who died on November 26 when 2 helicopters were traveling, and they collided at nightfall just as they were sweeping in to support troops who were battling Islamist militants. It was one of the worst losses of life in France history in more than 3 decades. Just another side note about that. I think it's interesting that the president of France is saying, y'all have to come over to France now because of this helicopter crash, because common sense says, well, the helicopter crash is 2 helicopters that collided in France. So it's 2 helicopters, not the people on the ground who shot down the helicopters, not the people on the ground throwing things at the helicopters. They just collided. So clearly that's not something that you would attribute to anti-French sentiment. So the question is, if that has nothing to do, like the helicopters colliding has nothing to do with anti-French sentiment, why is the French president saying this now? And what I believe is happening is that people in France, they sense the anti-French sentiment, especially with the countries who have decided to withdraw from the national reserves, starting with the president of Benin, who said that he's taking his money out of the French national reserves. But overall, they're starting to hear people like Kimi Siba, who have been voicing that the West African countries have to distance themselves from France. And so to me, he's using this helicopter crash as an excuse to say that the West African countries need to come to France, because he wants to ensure that they have his loyalty. Because otherwise, of course, there's helicopter crashes happen whenever there's wars that are going on. A lot of tragedies happen, but you don't necessarily put that on the people and say that that's your fault. You say that that's an accident. So it's just interesting, the timing of this. It's interesting, the timing of him making this accident out to be attributed to the anti-French sentiment instead of it just being a casualty of war. So that shows you right there that there's an agenda behind this meeting, him trying to get the West African countries to come to France. Okay, so moving on. France has thousands of troops fighting extremists and hunting down their commanders in the Western Sahel in an operation known as Barkhane. It's France's largest overseas operation. It has a budget of 600 million euros. Yet Al-Qaeda and Islamic State militants are still growing, even with France there, and they're spreading across borders, and with mounting deaths anti-French sentiment is surging. Meaning, although France has been there supposedly fighting Al-Qaeda, they're fighting Al-Qaeda has done nothing to actually lessen the attacks that have been happening to the people, or has done nothing to lessen the influence of Al-Qaeda or any militants. So the people are wondering, if you're supposed to be out here intervening with what's going on with Al-Qaeda, why is Al-Qaeda still here if you're supposed to be doing these things? Which begs the question, are they really doing what they said they're doing, or are they rather there to do something else outside of what they're saying, outside of the military operations? And, you know, I do think that one of the strong things that the things that they really strongly try to impose inside of these regions is they want their presence to be felt, because if their presence militarily is not felt, people will forget the fact that the French government is a powerful military power, and otherwise they might start actually trying to change things as far as the relationship between France and Africa. So I think it's more of trying to establish their dominance in the region, not trying to fight Al-Qaeda or fight Islamic militants as they have said they are. So going on. Okay, so the president of France says about West African countries, these are sovereign countries, right? They owe us clarity for them to ask us to be there, and yet that they assume it. Macron says we are not there out of some colonial or business interests, he says. So he's saying, oh, we're not here for colonialism, which is a weird thing to say if you're not there for colonialism, right? When asked if he would withdraw the troops, Macron said he'd draw consequences from talks with the African leaders. I need clarifications to maintain my troops there. So you have it there. The president of France has summoned a number of West African countries to France and said, you need to explain yourselves about why it is that there's this anti-French sentiment, and about what is our role inside of the region at this point. Because as I stated, he's clearly becoming nervous. So let's just understand, these military exercises that are going on in West Africa, this is just another leg of colonialism. This is just another way to control the West African people, to control the former Francophone countries. And anything else that he says other than that is a bold-faced lie. Let's also understand that this meeting is not something he's doing because of the helicopter accident. It's something that he's doing to ensure that he has the allegiance of these leaders, and to ensure that he's not going to be the president that basically loses control of Africa. Because every other French president, they've been very clear that role that Africa plays in France is something vital to the survival of the French people and of the French government, as far as maintaining a strong economic sphere of influence inside of this world. So that's all I have on this story, you guys. I will see you all in another video. Hi everyone, this is Tierney Cherie. As I've stated in a number of videos, I am part of an organization called WeChargeColonialism, and we are seeking to go to the United Nations for the purpose of petitioning the United Nations for recognition that the United States is guilty of colonizing African Americans. How have they been colonizing us? If you look at every single system in the United States government, whether it's the education system, whether it's the prison system, whether it's the banking and mortgage system, every single system shows that the United States government has put us into a position where they are benefiting off of our suffering. They are benefiting off of our labor. They are benefiting off of our misery. This is the type of relationship that occurs inside of a colony, where the host country is benefiting from the colony. They're abstracting resources. They're abstracting manpower. They're abstracting anything that they can from that people, and leaving the people with nothing, leaving the people destitute. Now, the reason why this is important is because we have to recognize that this is what has happened to our people in the United States, the same way as what has happened to our people in the Caribbean, to our people on the continent of Africa, to people all throughout the world. But if we recognize that the African Americans who are enslaved in America were also colonized and are still being colonized, then that means that we have a right to redress. That redress means we have internal self-determination. We have the right to control our institutions. We have the right to control our criminal justice system. The same system that has been oppressing us, when it has been controlled by the outside government, we have a right to control that government ourselves. We have a right to control our police departments. We have a right to control our education systems. We have a right to control our child welfare systems. Now, many of you might be thinking, they're not going to let us control our systems. Well, you need to do your history, because if you know about the Native American movements, you know that there was a time where the United States government was not willing to to recognize their right to self-governance. However, because they rallied the people, because they organized the people, they were able to actually impose to not just impose, but to put into the Congress the mentality that, you know what, these Native Americans, they do deserve the right to their own selves, because we have not been doing well by them. We have not been doing well by them, and that we've been taking their children, we have been oppressing them, we've been taking their land, we've been inflicting warfare on them. Because of that, we cannot rightfully claim that we have a right to these people, or they have a right to be under our government. The same thing should be of the mentality of African Americans, that we have to understand that every single system in the United States, since its inception, has been made and built to oppress us. If you think that's going to change in the near future, I'm very curious to know why and how, because there's no sign of it changing, and there's no sign of the wealth gap closing. In fact, the wealth gap's only getting worse. That means that we're only going to be more oppressed. We're only going to be more subjugated. We're only going to be more taken advantage of. So for that reason, we have to have control of our institutions, and we have control of our institutions. We make a rightful claim that our people have been the victim of colonization, have been a victim of racism, slavery, have been a victim of something that has amounted and caused our people to be in severe distress today. So it is for that reason why we're going to the United Nations, and we're saying that we have been colonized, and the redress for that colonization is that we need control over our neighborhoods. We need control over the systems that are over-representing us. We need control over those systems, because the dominant system has proven time and time again that it will not do right by Black people. If you are interested in joining this effort, there are a number of committees that you can join. There's a membership support committee, there's a PR committee, there's a media relations committee, there's a project management committee. We have so many committees, and the fact is, so many of us have talents that are useful for this effort. Even if you think that, you know, maybe you're not necessarily an activist, maybe you don't want to necessarily draft a petition to go to the United Nations, but you just have some type of talent that you think that we could use as we do this effort, please join. Please email us at WeChargeColonialism. If you maybe you don't have any time, maybe you're completely booked up, but you just want to actually take a part in the effort and keep tabs on what's going on, become a WeChargeColonialism supporter. That way we can actually communicate with you what actions we're taking and what type of rallying we have to do as a people. But certainly if you have talents and abilities that you feel like could be useful to us, come join, help us out, because this is something that we're trying to do not for ourselves, but for the whole community of Black people in America. That is all we have on this. We will see you soon.